Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Well, welcome and many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. We're really excited to be joined by Dom Higgins, who is the Head of Health and Education for the Wildlife Trusts. But quickly, before we launch into the podcast, I just want to remind people that you can get a printed and an ebook version of the new Journal of Biophilic Design magazine on our website, journalofbiophilicdesign.com. As this printed version is an eco-friendly version, it's carbon neutral, and you can also buy versions on Amazon. You can read it on your Kindle. There's a paperback and also a hardback version. So please do go along and support that. That'd be great. But in the meantime, hi Dom. And I first saw Dom when I attended the NHS Forest Conference. Yes, there is one. And where he recently spoke about biomimicry, jellyfish, bulletproof Kevlar, amongst many things, which were completely fascinating. But he also did a call for policy change. Dom, can you tell us about yourself and what got you interested in nature and wildlife, and a little bit about your journey, please?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you very much for having me, Ness. I'm one of those sort of accidental kind of entrants into the sector, I would say. Um, I'm not classically somebody who was really into wildlife, to be honest, as a child or anything like that. I'm a drama graduate, much more into showing off and acting and stuff. So I basically kind of fell into this through. I used to work in the gap year industry, organizing kind of placements overseas. And then when I was in Thailand, I came across a turtle conservation project called Golden Buddha Beach, which was as amazing as it sounds. But what was more amazing was the partnerships that they built up with a UK organisation called the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers, who I have never heard of. And so I got back to UK and looked them up, and I spoke to one of their international team, Anita, and the way that she described partnerships and the way that you build up the skills and capacity of other organisations around the world, it just kind of blew me away, really. And it made me realize that while there was probably some good in the work I was doing, it was largely market driven, and people who could pay to go off on placements, and certainly those who were career steppers. And so I kind of looked them up, kept an eye on them, and applied for a job, and got it doing kind of national youth volunteering programs and that kind of stuff. So unusual route, not the usual one, but I learn every day because I didn't know a huge amount about wildlife.
Well, you know lots now. Can you share with us, please, why for you it's important that we connect with nature on a personal level?
Yeah, there's a number of things around that. There's something intrinsic in all of us, and I'm no doubt you've covered this many times, but you've just got to trust how you feel when you get outside. It's a personal thing, certainly. If some people feel it in the woodlands, some if you just kind of step out into the wind, others you might just be looking at something poking out of the pavement and just really focusing in on it. But there's something absolutely in our makeup that takes us back to really what we're about as humans. And I think the way I understand it, and it's been explained to me before, is around we need three things really for good health and well-being. One is this kind of sense of a purpose, and that you have meaning to your life, and you can see that in some of the pathways to nature-connectedness. Some great research there. The second is around having an active environment. And I think this probably goes back to when we were hunter-gatherers. The fact that if you move people inside and you remain stationary, then you have the perfect ingredients for kind of stress, really. Because what we should be doing is being outside, away from artificial lights and those sorts of things. So there's definitely something around that. And then the third thing, because we are those kind of pack animals, is those social connections. So it's people, place, and purpose. And I think if you take any one of those away, then you've got the ingredients for what we recognize as modern stress or chronic stress, and all of those things that could happen physically to us and mentally.
I mean, you've touched on that. What happens to our health if we don't connect? I mean, what happens as well, you know, to our planet and wildlife if we choose or we don't connect with nature?
There's that growing sense of if you have it's often referred to as nature connectedness, but I think it's quite a hard concept, particularly if you're working in a kind of more hard-nosed policy areas like I sometimes find myself in. But it is a feeling. It's a feeling of what is going on in the world. It's a feeling of understanding that you're part of something bigger, and experts and people who are qualified in this may look at ecosystems or interrelations. But if you don't have that kind of daily thought, or that kind of sense of knowing that everything has a place and it's connected back to pretty much everything you do, essentially our life support system. If you look today, you look at some of the decisions being taken around the world, both here and abroad, and you think you wouldn't take that decision, you wouldn't make it if you had that feeling, that sense of connectedness and that understanding. Because there's perfectly valid ways to grow economically or create fair and sustainable employment and those sorts of things. And maybe that's not what people's drivers are, but that's a different conversation. But really, if you don't have that innate within you, and that might come from daily kind of playing out that we used to do, it might come from a kind of watching something on TV is perfectly valid. If you know it's absolutely, or getting that understanding. But really, from the food you eat to the way you travel to the water you drink to the air you breathe and all those sorts of things, if you don't have that kind of that sense at your core, then yeah, the planet and therefore our health is doomed. Because you know, whether that's to do with not being physically active, or whether it's not through that connection with biodiversity, or it's not through kind of joining like-minded groups of people, or if it's just understanding the meaning in nature, all of those sorts of things, then you know there's a deficit, I think, as it's sometimes described, and you know it can't help but have an impact on both you kind of psychologically, as well as kind of physically, if you're not connecting in that sort of way.
Yeah. I mean, in your talk for the NHS in the NHS Forest Conference, you advocate that recovery of nature must be done by people. So, you know, obviously, I mean, yes, it's obvious that that's what we should do, you know, but how do we get people to act? How do we get people to act? How do we, I mean, I'm saying it's obvious. It was obvious that probably most of our listeners, because we're probably on that side of things, rather than just thinking, oh, it's fine, we'll just shut the door and let the animals and the wildlife and the plants and things get on with it. We do need intervention, and we need positive action. But how do you, I know it's the, you know, what's the vision of the Wildlife Trust, and, you know, maybe what's your personal vision as well, you know, and what do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because you say it's obvious, and to me, and it's great that it is to you. But I think my starting point is where we are on this journey and what the reports and the evidence is telling us. And if you look at any of the indicators, whether it's kind of state of nature from RSPB, WWF worldwide surveys about kind of species that we've had recently, looking at levels of disconnection that drop off in our kind of team, you know, it's all pointing the wrong way. And, you know, if you look at what we're baked in now in terms of climate change, pretty much saying it's 2 degrees We can't, that's where you have catastrophic changes and major changes, depending on where you are in the world, to the way that the natural environment behaves and works. And so my starting point really is it hasn't worked to date. There've been some great victories and some great savings, some reintroductions, those sorts of things, but essentially we're still in that phase of pushing nature into ever smaller kind of protected pockets. So when I talked about nature's recovery, and when the wildlife trusts talk about nature's recovery, it literally that it's reconnecting those systems. So following those, what some of you will have heard of, the Lawton principles of more, bigger, better, and joined up. And if you've got to kind of repair and basically give nature a chance. When you're adapting now to climate change, so let alone trying to mitigate it, but if you're adapting to it, it's going to be vital for, heat kind of spots, providing cooling and shade there, carbon sinks, cleaning the air in our cities, and all sorts of really important ecosystem services. But actually, I think if you recognize that hasn't worked to date, and you're largely looking at about a third of the population in the UK, let's say, who have been concerned about this, and let's be honest, we know who those third are. It's largely kind of white and middle class. Big sweeping statement, but that is where we are. You have to undertake the recovery of nature with communities, diverse, new voices, people with fresh ideas and solutions, people that could take it to unexpected places. So it's talked about in the stock exchange or the factories or the taxis, whatever it might be. It just needs to become the business of everybody. And you can't do that if you carry on that same trajectory, even if you just follow the very sensible kind of ecological guidance, because actually it's not working. And so there's a social justice side of this in terms of people's access to nature that's really important, and but I think if you are looking at really recovering nature to the extent it needs to be, so that it is a natural solution to climate change and we all get the health and well-being benefits, it has to be hand in glove with people. So to me, it's two sides of the same coin. So when I hear nature's recovery, I automatically think that's loads of people who we need to get in. But I don't think that's the automatic voice of lots of people in our sector, actually. But the wildlife trusts do have that embedded in our 3 strategic goals, which is kind of nature's recovery is 1. So 30% of land and sea in recovery by 2030. 2 is 1 in 4 people taking action for nature or climate change. That clearly says we can't do it alone. We're not going to do that. So partnerships, new communities, new voices. So that's a huge culture change and listening program. And the 3rd goal is what we're talking about today. It's around demonstrating societal value that nature has, and those kind of what people call nature-based solutions to climate change, or in this case, to our health and social care challenges.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's sort of excited me when I was starting to explore biophilic design. I mean, because I'm not a designer, but when I started learning about the principle, it just sort of it ticked a huge box to be able to access people who are involved in construction, building, design, architects, town planners, city planners, urban planners. If we can use, from that point of view, by using the term biophilic design, you know what I mean? It's actually reconnecting our love of nature and our inherent need to be surrounded by nature as like one of the main sort of design goals that they use in order then to be able to cascade a whole kind of bunch of stuff that will help. So like you just mentioned, so you've got the biodiversity, ecodiversity, but you've also got, the social equity side of things, that people have, poor people, everybody from every community be able to have access to trees and a park near where they live. So they then, because there's also been studies that if you're surrounded by greenery, if you're surrounded by nature and you're surrounded by trees and plants and stuff, you're going to act in a more sustainable way, which then will obviously encourage people to then get more involved in cleanups and planting and trees and respect, and therefore not, put asphalt in their driveways and all that stuff, yeah, I'm excited about, there's more and more voices in this side of things who are really advocating sustainable building practices and using localized construction materials as well. I was just on the COP27 conference just now for they were launching the global status report for building construction, and there was a lady on there who was talking about localized construction, and how we use local materials, which I just think this is definitely the way to go, but we need to have that on a policy level globally, to help people try and hit that 2050 target, which at the moment is way off, as you know, it's off the scale. So
yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think if you not only is it about kind of building with nature and local materials and those sorts of things, but you've got influential bodies such as I think it's UK Health Alliance came out last week, basically calling on the UK to stop subsidizing fossil fuels, reduce air pollution, but actually I think it said create equitable access to green space, brackets, by prioritizing protection and development, high quality nature, but within 10 minutes of everybody, so I think if and there they used the example of a local park, but there are things you can do in buildings to actually weave in nature to the design, make them much more resilient to climate change, but also ensure that within that 10 minutes of your house, if you're able to get out, it's there for you. And I'm one for saying you need to, although there's guidance, and there has been for a while, it's actually legislation. It's got to be mandatory, otherwise there's always a cheaper way of doing it, and that's not the way to do it. So I think you've got to legislate for it and cost it.
Because you can't, it seems like we can't rely on people like doing the right thing. It always comes down to money, and it's not necessarily the people who are like, they've got good intentions, but then it gets cut because people are looking at the bottom line and thinking, oh, is that going to, but there's cheap ways of doing things. There's cost effective ways of bringing it in. It doesn't always have to be, cost so much money, really. But I mean, what tips would you give? I mean, people are listening to this. I've got sort of teachers and doctors and healthcare workers and interior designers and just families as well as architects and MPs and people listening to this. But what advice would you give them to get engaged in the solution? Should they be lobbying people? Should they be actually going out and doing stuff, or what, or getting community groups up? What would you sort of say for people to do?
It's interesting, and it's so if you take us back to that middle goal I spoke about, and we feel that 1 in 4 taking action for nature and climate is the way, that the reason that there's a lot of kind of campaigning evidence around that being a tipping point. So then the question becomes, what is meaningful in terms of that action? And really, I wouldn't want to say to a certain profession or a certain kind of person in a scenario what it is. I've got within of those professions that you mentioned there are policy goals that I work towards, but they're based in what I am told. So I think what I start to do, I always start by listening and working out what those challenges are, because it could be all very well if I say, green prescribing is great, or blue prescribing is great, let's all go and have a load of health practice. But actually talking to doctors and health practitioners and people in the NHS and decision makers and budget holders for the estates will tell you any number of challenges, whether that's to do with the kind of pests on hospital sites through to patients saying, no, you are just trying to cut money. This is what I want from you as my GP. And you prescribing a social thing is absolutely not the case. So if I speak to those doctors and they say, actually, I'm sold on this, and I think it's a circular conversation, I think, rather than tips for me, because now there are plenty of GPs, for example, who will say, you know what, there is somebody that will benefit from an activity that means they're socially connected, safe, and physically or mentally active. And if you can do that, I think within time we will see an impact on our profession, freeing up the time to do what I need to do. We'll see a benefit for nature, that kind of premium on top of the health and social gains. And if you times it all up across, you know, the hundreds of thousands of GPs across the country, then you know, it builds up to a big impact. So and I know it's slightly different from the question, but I think what action people take is very kind of personal, and it's also down to their lives. And if somebody for the first time in their life switches on a David Attenborough film and just has a think and think, oh my God, and that's it for the year, you know, some people will say, God, that's terrible, you got to go out and do this or the other. But I'm saying, you know, where did they start that journey? You know, where did that come from? So I think you need to apply it. I think that could be immensely positive for lots of areas. Whereas I meet other campaigners who they send postcards to their MPs, they send them back to the GPs when they've been out doing kind of a group describing, saying, you know, this worked for me, that was fantastic. They go and meet their MPs and say, do you know what? The rule bill, 570 pieces of legislation coming in from Europe, that is a risk. Can't you see it's a risk? You're absolutely, you know, and they will just go, you know, all the way up. But I'm not, who am I to say what's more meaningful than you know, one than the other? I think what's clear is the positive thing about that 1 in 4 means we're going to reach way more of the parts that the environment sector hasn't reached so far. So it's definitely got to be done with partners and organizations and businesses. And you know, I'm quite hopeful in a way. So yeah, long answer.
Yeah, no, it's lovely because people, I think people are more and more sensitive to nature and the wildlife, and I think it has come all from like COVID lockdown, so it has reached parts that it might not have reached, unfortunately. You know, fortunately in one way, but unfortunately because of the cause of what it does. But you know, people getting out in nature and walking and realizing there's no park near me, and then setting up like little, you know, putting plant pots near benches and all this sort of stuff to try and create a bit of greenery and a bit of beauty actually in such a harsh environment. If we think, you know, particularly in the inner cities where it's all concrete and it's grey and there's no color and there's no life, you know, we so need it. And in schools as well, you know, we need those views of windows and stuff. There's all this research that's been proven that, you know, we study better if we got views of nature. So actually from an educational point of view is better. Healthcare as well, we get out of hospitals quicker. You know, I mean, I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, but you know, there's all these things that if people are interested in it, they can kind of go off and research about it and then get involved in it. You know, as you said, there's not one size fits all, and there's no need to be prescriptive or anything. It's actually and I love that what you just said about something that fits into their lives. You know, if it calls to them and it's the right time, and there's an opportunity, then go for it, go do it, because you feel better for it as well if you feel like you're helping too, don't you? And the community aspect. So
you do, and that's the kind of cultural change going on at the Wildlife Trust. If you look at this approach we're calling Team Wilder, people's entry points or gateways into this world, this sector, if you like, environment sector, whatever you want to call it, or just being connected to nature, will come in many forms. And you know, I will have colleagues that will hold their hands up in horror and say, you know, it could be a few barbecues somewhere, you know, or it could be a bike trail, or it could be, you know, and it's just like that's the place to start the conversation. I once spoke to a very wise public health professional who, for the first 2 weeks as they were starting the job, goes, what's your first month? You know, you get those, what's your first week? What's your first 2 weeks? What's your month? Basically said, yeah, I'm going to go and go into the shops, the supermarkets, the pubs, the bars, betting shops, and I'm going to listen, and I'm just going to tap into actually what it's like to live here and what people are saying and what's missing and those kind of things. I think how refreshing is that from a very kind of super qualified epidemiologist, and actually they're just going to go out and listen to people's lives where they are. I think we could do with a lot more of that.
Absolutely. Going back on the education sort of aspects of things, I'm going to ask you something to lighten it up in a minute, just at the end, kind of near the end. But there's a new natural history GCS, I'm saying that again, a new natural history GCSE, that's going to obviously tackle this issue of the loss of nature and our connection to it. You've obviously been involved in this, haven't you? And you're advocating it. Can you tell us about? Can you tell us a bit about? Can you kind of sort of set the scene a little bit? Can you tell us what this natural history GCSE will kind of cover? Who it's aimed at? Is it live? Now, sort of thing as well. So,
yeah. So I think if listeners, want to make sure it gets over the line, then there's still work to be done. So particularly, if you are in touch with your MP or you want to write part for education, or if you visit wildlife trusts and have a look at their postcard campaign, you can say how important it is, because at the moment it's on a first teach of September 2025. We got the okay for a GCSE in natural history, and that was by the schools minister. I have lost count, but it was when Robin Walker was in post. And it was announced along with in England, this is the Department for Education's Climate Change and Sustainability Strategy. And within that, it says there will be a new GCSE, first one in a good 20 odd years, in natural history. And in order for it does seem a way off, but that is the earliest it can be, because there are a number of things that now the Department for Education have to do with Ofqual in order to get the syllabus, the marking schemes, get an agreement, look at who's going to teach it, all of the really important detailed stuff. So I suppose that's to kick off. So yes, it's there, it's a commitment, but as we've seen, it can mean very little until we've seen it absolutely in writing. So not there yet. So yeah, I was on the advisory group, my colleague is now, and I'm working with Oxford Cambridge RSA, who are the examination board for that, who are behind the natural history GCSE, but also a much wider and possibly not more, but equally as important, wider greening and bluing of the whole curriculum, and in the run up to that. So what would it bring to the party? So a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of the natural world, the stuff that we've been talking about. So urban, rural, coastal, and the global context. So it kind of, because people might look and say, well, there's geography and there's biology, but it's that kind of, that space in between, the in-depth knowledge of the taxonomy and going out and close-up observation, getting dirty, getting outside the classroom, looking at animals and plants and all those kind of things. So really applying critical research skills, observation, identification, classification, but also, if you zoom out then, tying that to real-world solutions to climate change, looking at not just a UK or a Western-centric view of that, but actually saying, what are the impacts of the world, but what are the kind of, what's the thinking and the processes and the solutions in other parts of the world where you kind of mitigate climate change, but also how you start to adapt to it. So it's taking the interconnection of all those kind of ecosystems, but going way back to natural history, checking the roots of all of those things, learning them in depth, and then applying to the modern world. And there's a real kind of dearth of those. And the person behind it, it'd be very remiss not to mention it, it's Mary Colwell. She has been driving this for years, and formerly the BBC Natural History Unit. The question, when you look at it, you're looking at, one, where are the naturalists, and what's the diversity of the naturalists coming through? Where is that interest? Where is our next kind of leader on these sorts of massively important issues? And if you haven't got that kind of, it's a critical point, isn't it, the GCSE in your kind of education, because it's the time that takes you up to that point where you have to be in education. You don't have to obviously take this GCSE yet. It's not a core subject. That's perhaps something to aim for beyond. So and at the moment you're thinking, okay, it could be 30 to 40,000 people, about the same level as sociology, one of those kind of subjects on the side. I think what we need to do is establish it and then absolutely rocket fuel it up to, you know, kind of getting it into core. And therefore, so yeah, it's still in the mix. It's not over the line. I think the routes up to that and the pathway towards that GCSE as you go through key stages 1, 2, and 3. You know, it's no surprise that you lose that nature connection at 13 because it is easier to get children outside of primary. There's no space in the primary curriculum. There's kind of less fear in the teachers. There's probably less safety concerns and those sorts of things. But actually, what you need to do is thread knowledge as well as that experience. So it really hammers it home. So you give people, you open their eyes and think, do you know what? If I am interested in this sort of thing, this is the exactly the type of subject that I would want to take. And then from there you go. So it's you know, a massive consultation went ahead. There was 2,000 plus young people that fed into that as well. So it's a really well informed consultation process. If you're, yeah, if the listeners can look at the Department for Education's climate and sustainability strategy and the GCSE in that, let's keep on it. I'm pretty hopeful it will still be on that first teach of 2025. And then we get the exciting thing of building the curriculum with our partners and taking that learning outside and just experiencing it. I think it'll have a massive difference.
That's great. I mean, when you said there about, you know, it's experience, but the key thing there was you said, you know, thread the knowledge through the, you know, and the experience. So it's great going out there and experiencing the trees and nature and looking and observing, but actually understanding, you know, how mycelium work and how, you know, root connections and all this sort of stuff, and get people, you know, there's lots and lots of like things on YouTube and there's like things on films and you know, and you know, all the sort of channels that we look at now. There's more and more stuff coming in, and I think it's becoming more accessible. But I mean, gosh, I mean, I would have loved that when I was a student. Do you know what I mean? To really, you know, I mean, go outside and enjoy nature anyway, which is lovely. I never had that opportunity. I was in a city in London, but actually to go out and learn about it. I mean, I was a real nerd anyway. But I mean, you know, there are kids who will just really get off on the fact that, gosh, that's how that's connected to this, and you know, there's all the sort of diversity and how things are dependent on each other, and then we'll become, you know, that'll filter down as well into like, you know, respecting each other as well, because we're all interdependent as well, you know. So there's like loads of things that you could bring in on an interdisciplinary level as well. I love it. I think it's brilliant. I'm actually interviewing Mary Caldwell in January, so I'd be interested to hear her background story and where she's come from, because I know she's interested in curlews as well, isn't she? So I love curlews. Yeah, so
yes, she is indeed, and is quite a force. So that's fantastic. And I think what's the other thing, because obviously Mary, who will tell you about the kind of concerns she has around naturalists and would say that much better. For me, you know, I'm surrounded by colleagues, particularly in the policy area, who will look at the latest threat to farming, clean rivers and water, the seas, fishing stocks, our soils, the future of food. The list goes on and on and on and on. And think, actually, these are because decisions are being made. So what we need is the next generation to go through this, so that in 30 years' time, people in our positions will not be fighting this nonsense. Actually, because nobody would make that decision, because they've been through a totally different education. So that's why it's really vital.
Right, great. And just on that sort of note, if there's, you know, if someone's listening to this, and if you got, so I know on that NHS Forest conference, you spoke about various bits and bobs, like jellyfish and all sorts of things. Can you kind of like give us just like a really odd sort of fact about something random that we're going to go, ooh, and they can take it down the pub. They can take it down the pub with them tonight. So
I mean, to me, yeah, the jellyfish one you use. So they use GFP, don't they? So green fluorescent proteins as markers in X-rays. You see those amazing jellyfish. But my favourite really is the cone snail, which are these kind of amazing creatures. And what they've got is very, very precise kind of weapon that paralyzes its prey, and with just the kind of right amount of kind of poison, and that I think they're called peptides or conopeptides. It's been kind of taken and worked up into non-addictive anesthetics. And so if you can imagine the kind of, because it's so targeted and so effective, it's got all of those sorts of properties, and particularly where you're looking at that kind of non-addictive side, it's really important.
Yeah.
And these kind of peptides, I think we've looked at 0.0004% of them across the cone snails population. So you can imagine the huge potential, and there's so many other kind of amazing animals and what they bring. But if you think about that potential and how we could be in harmony with nature and those sorts of things, if I then tell you that their habitat is coral reefs, then I think we see the problem here. With bleaching and through the temperature rise and those sorts of things. So that's one of my favorites, and the other reason it's really one of my kind of favorites is because it was I first learned about it from an amazing guy called David Pension, who used to head up the NHS's Sustainability and Sustainable Development Unit.
Okay.
So it's from a healthcare point of view, and he used to wax lyrical about the cone snails at a lot of his conferences. So it's not, I didn't learn that from a naturalist. I learned that from a health professional.
That's fantastic. I'm gonna have to look that up. I remember you mentioning it, and it's a really beautiful snail. It's got a lot, it's a really interesting shaped creature. So I'll put a picture on our website, the journalbiphilicdesign.com, alongside this podcast. So if people are listening, they can pop along. They can obviously Google it, but they can also pop along to the website and have a look there. So before I ask you the final question, Dom, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think at this point we haven't really touched on kind of nature prescribing and the current kind of trials in that area. And I think it's really interesting. So social prescribing is the broad policy. I think in some way it's quite problematic in terms of people to understand, but it's one of those terms that's well used around the world. And it's basically community-based or place-based approach to health. And I think if we're going to stop the NHS in this country falling over, we've got to do things different. And that means, I think we said earlier on, if you can connect people to social activities where you're physically active, socially active, safe, in the company of others, it could be anything. Then, you're much less likely to go to a GP for a social need or to turn up an A&E because you need to see a human. And a lot of this is loneliness driven. If we look across the natural environment and arts in terms of cinema, theatre, music, all those kind of things, and sport and physical activity and games and those sorts of things, different kind of clubs. If you look at what they bring, then the theory goes that if you are connected to those, you're less likely to go and to a healthcare professional for a social kind of purpose. So I think it's a really good argument in that. And I think if you talk to GPs from them, if you look at the stats, up to a third or up to a quarter, they would say of their appointments are unnecessary because it's in those terms, and it's something that works alongside and complements mainstream healthcare. So you've got people, it's very important that people take their medication and they follow their GP's instructions and those sorts of things. However, the early signs of green prescribing are showing that you can have a really positive impact on the number of people going to GPs, the number of people turning up at A&E, people staying well if they're got on the elective list, it's really growing. And I think, the green prescribing for mental health pilots they're on at the moment, they started 2 years ago. The first year was largely COVID interrupted. So we're at quite a critical point in those. And I think what we need are for those kind of trials to continue for at least the next 2 years, so we can actually pick out some of those data and actually show how we take the weight out of the health system. And as we are here talking about biophilia and those kind of importance of recovering nature, that is one of the added benefits of this. It's not only about kind of staying well and staying healthy, but it's also about biodiversity, creating accessible places where people live, and driving organizations to work in specific places where it will have the most reach for people's health, but also the most in terms of creating access. Because if you do create access in those areas where people have the poorest health outcomes, all the evidence shows that you're going to have the greatest impact. I think if you do that in kind of medium to well-off places where health outcomes are okay, it's not going to have a massive impact. And it's not really surprising, but there is evidence pointing that way. So I think we're at a really interesting time. There is a kind of a question mark over the whole prescribing thing, because you don't want it to be a kind of a cost-cutting exercise for health services and put onto the civil society or charitable sector. But equally so, it makes a hell of a lot of sense for all the things we've been talking about today in terms of diversifying a number of voices that are going to fight for nature recovery by showing its relevance and its beneficial kind of impact. And just another one of those interesting gate points into the environment sector that is not via the usual degree, studied it, volunteered for a while because you were well supported and you get a job. We need to break that down. So it's really important.
That's great. Thank you. I think I've told you before, but I wanted to bring a policy change, obviously at government level, but to bring biophilic design into the NHS, like into every NHS, like as a whole thing, so that's in every retrofit, everything. So there's views of nature, people have got that. There's better acoustics, all those different aspects of like bringing nature and elements and patterns of nature inside, everything from colorways to plants to, views of nature to soundscapes and visual representations. If they can't cut a hole in the wall, we know that, they can recover faster. I just want everybody, however much money they've got, I want them to all have a great experience and a healing experience in nature, in healthcare, and that has to be done through it's enhanced through a connection to nature. So anyway, we'll see how it goes.
I think that's brilliant. And if you look at actually, because that's really effective and really important. If you look at the way they redesigned the Alder Hey Children's Hospital, they turned the thing on its axis, and they did a massive consultation program with the key people, i.e. the children who are in there for horrendous reasons of procedures. What's most important? Outdoor facing rooms, away from the operating rooms, windows that open out into the park, because it used to face the car park, and now the three ways face right into the small green space. And lo and behold, there are long wings that come right out of that Alder Hey Children's Hospital right into the space. Needs to tell everything you need to know. It's in that case study.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end, so I have to ask you the final question that I ask everybody on this podcast. If you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like, Dom?
Oh my word! And it's such an interesting question, quite a challenging one. If I was to go very personally on this, so I'm not sure about painting the world, but I always have a love of jumping into bodies of water. So I think it would definitely be very watery, whether that's kind of brown bubbling stuff that, I used to jump into the River Ribble as a kid, one of my favorite rivers, or whether it's sort of those chalk streams you see down in Hampshire, or beautiful clear kind of crystal seas, or those kind of, messy, pebbly, sandy surf that kind of pummel you around. I just love it all. So I think we've got quite a lot of blue on the planet already. So I'm personally, from that point of view, I think that's where I go.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.